They called it a cleanup mission. Routine. Orbital sanitation, they said, with a straight face and a short briefing. We were supposed to intercept and dismantle obsolete satellite fragments that had begun clustering over the South Pacific Corridor, a stretch of orbital real estate often used as a graveyard for dead tech. I'd done similar runs before retrieving solar panels, defunct transmitters, old weather survey units, but nothing had ever come down through command this quiet. The manifest was stripped to a single line, grid That-9, altitude 340 kilometers. Mass fluctuation detected. No object ID, no agency tag, no decay trajectory. Just coordinates and a time stamp that didn't line up with any known launch window. I should have flagged it. I should have asked questions. But I'd seen enough high-clearance jobs to know that the more you asked, the closer you got to being removed from the list entirely. So I nodded, signed the waiver, and stepped onto the transport with 3 other contractors who looked just as tired and just as quiet as I did. We launched from Ascension platform under cold burn, no ceremony. Our craft designated as Helios 3 on the hull, but never referred to by name in our briefings, was fully automated, except for the cleanup crew. It was a sealed unit. No AI assistance on board. No uplink beyond shortwave intercom. That wasn't standard, but again, nothing about this felt standard. We reached orbital height in less than 4 hours, moving into grid That-9, just as the Earth's shadow curved beneath us like a slow eclipse. That was when we first saw it. The field. Debris, yes, but not like any pattern I'd logged before. It didn't drift or scatter. It was arranged, positioned, hundreds of fractured metallic limbs, reflective glass plates, twisted antennae, and none of them were tumbling. They hovered. Some rotated, yes, but on perfect, synchronized axes, as if some unseen hand was maintaining orientation. And at the center of it all, pulsing faintly, was the object. It wasn't listed. It wasn't tagged. It looked like a satellite, at first glance about the size of an early-era spy platform, cylindrical with braced solar fins, but those fins weren't solar. They bent inward, not outward. There were no transmission dishes, no thermal shielding, and no visible serials or country markings. Its outer shell was coated in a matte black surface that drank light. Only when one of the crew aimed a LiDAR burst at it did we see how it responded. Not by bouncing signal, but by absorbing it. The reading came back blank, total null, like trying to map a shadow in pitch dark. Our instruments glitched when locked onto it. HUD overlays froze. Our flight engineer, Cole, ran a secondary scan. He turned to me and said, "It's not on any database. I mean none. Nothing at NORAD, SpaceNet, or even ESA's legacy logs. It's like it was never launched." That's when I felt the first pull. Not physical, gravitational. Mental. Like something in the center of that cluster wanted attention. Not to be observed. To be recognized. Helios 3 adjusted position manually. No autopilot. No drift correction. Just thrusters firing at full burn as we approached within 200 meters of the object. We were close enough now to see minor pitting on its surface, like small impacts had been covered over by organic growth. That was the word that came to mind. Organic. Because the closer we got, the less it looked like machinery. One of the fins twitched. Not swayed. Twitched, as if it had joints. I stared through the porthole, breath held, and for a second, just a blink eye, thought I saw condensation form on the glass from the inside. We weren't transmitting any logs, so I turned on the internal recorder. My voice, clipped and dry. "This isn't debris. This is deliberate." Command didn't answer when we tried the emergency ping. It didn't bounce back either. The signal just vanished. Like it hit something that wasn't supposed to be there. We logged the blackout, switched to manual recorders, and initiated proximity approach under Mission Clause 7B. Visual integrity verification. Translation: if you see something, touch it. Even if you shouldn't. We launched the tether drone, an old R-16, fitted with a radiation cam. It floated toward the object with a gentle hiss, trailing wire. When it reached 15 meters, the object reacted. Not violently, just awareness. One of the inward curved fins slowly reoriented, like an eyelid opening, and the drone's feed began to distort. Lines across the screen. Then silence. No crash, no data loss. Just a single still frame of something behind the object. A curve of light. A glint. Almost like A second structure. We looked at each other. 3 of us now. One of the crew Jules was in the back module. She didn't speak much, but she was our protocol officer. She approached with a printed schematic and old NASA diagram from the late 80s. She flipped it over and pointed to a blurry section marked Redacted Zone -1987 Recovery. I asked her where she got it. She just said, it was in the launch kit. We weren't supposed to have a launch kit. That was the moment I knew this wasn't cleanup. This was retrieval. And the thing we were here for had never been lost. It had been buried, quietly, out here in a place with no weather, no gravity, and no ice. I checked the time. The logs had stopped updating. The clock on the dashboard now looped the same minute, 3:17 UTC. We'd entered the debris field at 3:17. We'd seen the object at 3:17. The drone launched at 3:17. I looked out the viewport again and counted 7 solar flares on the edge of the Earth's horizon. And yet it was still 3:17. I tapped the glass. It was warm, not from sunlight. From the outside. We were parked in vacuum, 340 kilometers above sea level. Nothing should be warm. The object's surface began to shimmer, just slightly, as if refracting heat waves. Then a faint pulse barely audible vibrated through the hull of Helios 3. Not enough to shake it, but enough to feel it in the chest. It repeated once every 8 seconds. Like a heartbeat. Cole backed away from the panel. That thing's alive, he whispered. I opened my log recorder, keyed in one line, and pressed save. But the recorder blinked twice. Then displayed, you're not the first. And that's how it started. They pulled the original briefing from the system the morning after the incident. I know, because I watched the file vanish in real time, while trying to cross-reference orbital decay patterns from the South Pacific Quadrant. 1 second, it was their Thatonine debris analysis. Scheduled sweep 0417, and the next it flickered, blurred, and collapsed into a single line of corrupted data, replaced by a blank, access denial, and a red flashing string. Clearance elevated silent protocol, red. That was the first time I saw the phrase in writing. I hadn't heard of the silent protocols before this mission. Not in all my years with the Orbital Recovery Division. Not through any contractor whisper chains. Not even in the fringe black-budget rumors that sometimes trickled in from the ghost crews over the Andes launch pads. The phrase felt too clean, too administrative. But the dread it carried wasn't. It was the kind of warning that doesn't ask you to stop. It reminds you that continuing won't mean you'll be punished. It means you'll be erased. After the pulse. After the clock froze at 3:17. After the drone vanished and we logged that flicker of impossible warmth through vacuum-sealed hull plating. We were told to stand by. Not by command. No, because command was silent. The Helio 3 didn't receive signals anymore. Not in any conventional spectrum. But the ship turned. Not the debris field. Not the object, the ship itself turned. No thruster engaged. No navigation command initiated. I remember gripping the handrail and feeling the shift in inertia. It didn't feel like we rotated. It felt like the stars reoriented. I looked through the viewport and realized that we were now facing Earth, but not our Earth. That's the best way I can describe it. The landmasses were right. The curvature, the weather patterns, all correct. But the lights were wrong. No visible cities. No signal points. Just vast, dark terrain, where metropolises should have burned like electric constellations. We lost Jules that night. Not physically, not yet. But mentally, something left her. She stopped blinking. She pressed her forehead against the port window, and whispered something under her breath, for 13 minutes straight. I recorded it without her knowing, just as a precaution. Later, when I isolated the audio, I found she was repeating a Latin phrase. In tenebris, observant, non-mental. I didn't speak Latin. But a colleague back at a mission debrief years ago once translated something similar as in darkness they watch, not remember. At the time I thought it was religious. Now I think it was architectural. The Helios 3 was never in our mission manifest, I'm sure of it. We were meant to be deployed on an updated Fenris-class cleanup unit, something with better telemetry and updated shielding. Instead, we were launched in this relic cobbled together, stripped of AI navigation, and with paneling that didn't match any current fleet design. After the anomaly, I began inspecting the interior more closely. Under the storage deck, I found a maintenance plate engraved with 3 sets of initials and a date, BAR. JCN, L45 to 12.09, 91. None of those matched our crew, and the date, December 1991. No ship lasts 3 decades in low orbit without refits. Unless it was never meant to be recovered. There was more. Hidden beneath a false panel in the auxiliary compartment, wrapped in black fireproof cloth, was a mission binder with no agency seal. Just the words "Re-entry lock override auth classified." Inside, handwritten in fading ink, were protocols, old ones. Ones I'd seen only referenced in Cold War contingency theories, obscuration layers, observer containment, perceptual redundancy cancellation. These weren't military terms. They were philosophical mechanisms, ways to describe phenomena that shouldn't be perceivable, and yet somehow persisted in the conscious mind. The binder ended with one page, crumpled and torn at the edge, that simply read, "When the signal stabilizes, they will recognize you." Cole had been working on restoring part of the internal telemetry when he called me into the nav chamber. He'd unlocked an archive hidden under 6 layers of encryption, of which were coded in standard hexadecimal. The dataset, tagged Penumbra, contained flight paths for dozens of unregistered orbital vehicles dating back to 1982. All of them converged on That-9 every 15 years. A cycle, each marked with an identical final tag, Silent Protocol, OA. No return. That was when we both realized we weren't the first crew sent here. We were just the only ones still transmitting, if that word even applied anymore. Cole began running a check on our own flight recorder, timestamps. He paused. "We launched 7 days ago, right?" I nodded. He swallowed. "Then why does our oxygen log say we've been up here for 36? I tried to send a beacon to Ascension platform manually, piggybacking off a maintenance satellite in geosync orbit. The signal completed its jump, but returned no ping. Instead, the uplink console flashed a message I didn't recognize. It wasn't English. It looked like partial Unicode fragmented letters. I screenshotted it and ran it through a decryptor we kept offline. The closest translation I could get was, "Ship with no name recognized. Proceed to core alignment." It called us by designation we never gave. It knew we were here. That night, Jules went silent. Her breathing was steady, her body calm, but her eyes were locked open. We couldn't rouse her. Not with meds, not with light, not even with fluid stimulation. She was trapped in some kind of cognitive loop, her pupils dilating in pulses 3 slow, then 2 fast. I recorded the rhythm. When I ran it through a waveform interpreter, it translated into Morse. "Stay observing." We hadn't taught her that. She didn't know Morse. She was speaking through something. Cole and I barricaded the inner module and began scanning the ship for any dormant system we might have missed. That's when we discovered the second power core. It wasn't marked. It wasn't listed in any schematic, but it was active, pulsing slow heat at second intervals. We traced the wiring back behind the aft bulkhead, and we found something that stopped us both cold. A wall that shouldn't exist. It was built into the curvature of the hull like it had grown there. When we touched it, it resonated. Not like metal, like flesh under tension. I wish I could say I panicked, but I didn't. I was calm, unnaturally calm. Like the fear had been redirected somewhere else. I looked at Cole. He stared at the wall and whispered, "They've been here longer than we have," and I believed him. Because something inside that bulkhead was listening, not passively, intimately. It didn't want to be rescued. It wanted to remember what it was. As the artificial gravity began to distort, and the nav system displayed a location tag, we never set classified vector. Perigee, anomaly, inbound. I turned on my recorder again. My voice shook this time. "This is not a satellite cleanup. This is a retrieval loop. And we were chosen because we fit the pattern. This ship was already part of it. We just didn't know whose name was on it, until now." Then the lights dimmed, and a slow pulse echoed through the hull again, stronger this time. And we began to descend. There had never been a moment in all my previous missions where orbital mechanics defied themselves in real time, not like this. We were trained, even hardened, to trust in the rhythm of decaying paths, elliptical trajectories, and Newtonian predictability. Things fall, they spin, lose altitude, degrade. Entropy is the quiet law of space, and we were its janitors. But whatever this object was, whatever center mass it carried or energy it housed, it was not decaying. It was adapting. That was the conclusion we reached as we watched it slowly drift against its projected path. Not in some tumbling, desperate spiral, but with precise micro-corrections like a vessel aligning itself with something beyond visible reference points. There was no propulsion signature, no residual heat from maneuvering thrusters, no optical shimmer to betray ion emissions. And yet it moved not just physically, but with intent, like a sleeper turning to face a noise in the dark. Cole ran his 6th orbital scan in less than an hour, overlaid with both legacy US PSECOM data and real-time telemetry from the ship's decrypted Penumbra archive. The anomaly, designated only as Entity X in those redacted fragments, had shifted 0.003 degrees in inclination. To anyone else, it would seem negligible. To us, it was catastrophic. Objects in orbit don't just drift sideways against gravitational balance. Not without force. Not without sacrifice. Jules was still unresponsive, locked in that unnatural trance. But her pulse now echoed the same slow thump as the bulkhead at second intervals. Consistent, indifferent to the panic clawing at the rest of us. The wall that had pulsed with heat now felt cool, like it had given up pretending to be alive. Or perhaps had begun conserving itself for something greater. Then the logs began to change. The mission binder, once static and yellow now, contained new entries. Not visibly written by hand, not typed, simply there. Lines of data formed in real time, shifting ink on paper, reacting to our observations. Cole compared the entries with our own spoken words, recorded via the ship's environmental mic array. They matched, not just in phrasing, but in emotional cadence, as if the ship was copying our fears verbatim. One entry in particular stood out. A time-stamped passage logged precisely 2 minutes after we noticed the object's movement. It read, "Recognition achieved. Initiating course correction toward Origin Echo." I didn't know what Origin Echo meant at the time. Now I suspect it never referred to a place. It referred to a memory. That's when the proximity alarms activated. Not from the object we expected that, but from beneath us. A second anomaly had appeared, rising from lower orbit, at a velocity that should have torn it apart. It was small, metallic, an old early generation beacon capsule. The kind used before autonomous re-entry vehicles became standard. It wasn't listed in our mission, wasn't pinging any frequency we could decode. But it was coming straight for us, and it was broadcasting a loop in an encrypted band that no earthbound receiver could interpret. Cole finally cracked the signal through the legacy decryptor hidden in the archive files. What came through wasn't telemetry. It was a voice. Broken, half-corroded by time and compression, but unmistakably human. "This is Mission Lead, Harmon Blake. Year of record, 1993. Object responded. Mission compromised. Satellite isn't artificial. Repeat, isn't artificial." I remember sitting in the chair, fists clenched, the words pulsing through my headset like a ghost crawling up my spine. That name Harmon Blake matched one of the initials engraved on the maintenance plate below deck. BAR, JCN, L45. The capsule impacted the outer hull with a soft thud, magnetized automatically, and triggered a manual extraction sequence that none of us authorized. A compartment opened near the cargo bay. Inside, a preserved suit, marked with a faded insignia that didn't match any nation. Alongside it, a notebook in plastic casing. We didn't open it. Not yet. Because the ship began to move again on its own. Helios 3 initiated a slow, silent arc. Not a thruster push. Not a deceleration. The object we had come to inspect, Entity X, had changed position again. But not away. It was now directly beneath us, even though we hadn't tracked its movement. One moment it had been kilometers ahead, drifting calmly. The next, it was there. Hovering underneath our vessel, without speed. Without inertia, without even effort. It was like we had always been above it, and time had taken too long to inform us. That was when we noticed the anomaly with the stars. The background of space had subtly changed. The constellations through the viewport didn't match any known sky. Cole pulled up celestial charts from the ship's internal star map. According to the orientation, we were no longer over the South Pacific Corridor. We weren't even over Earth. At least not any Earth we could recognize. The magnetic poles had reversed. The thermospheric drift was off by 7 degrees. And the object below us, was no longer a satellite. Not in shape, not in motion. Its exterior had unfurled. The fins we once thought decorative now aligned themselves like petals, and from within, a spherical node pulsed with light in concentric waves. Not radiation, not even heat. Thought that was our impression. We were no longer observing something. It was observing us, testing us. The notebook from the capsule had begun to bleed ink along its edges. When we opened it, we found pages filled with mirrored handwriting, as if written by someone seeing their own reflection. It documented hallucinations, identity fractures, entire mission days missing from perception. The last page simply said, "We're not in orbit, we're in memory." Jules finally spoke that night. Not in words, but in perfect repetition of the 1993 transmission we'd just recovered down to the stutter. The vocal cadence, the panic, she had never heard it. Never even touched the playback systems. But her mouth moved in perfect unison with the original log. Cole and I watched in silence as she recited every last word, including fragments we had not yet decrypted. When she finished, her eyes rolled back, and a low-frequency hum began vibrating through the deck. The nav screen displayed a new vector. Inclination match, achieved alignment, complete awaiting initiation. The ship wanted something. No, the object wanted something. The message was clear. It had changed course. Now it was our turn. That night, I dreamed of a sea of light, possibly vast, stretching out across void and echo. The object was there, not moving, but pulsing in rhythm with my thoughts. It showed me a mirror, not of myself, but of every decision that had led me here. And then a word, not spoken, returned. I woke up screaming. But only because I didn't know what it meant to be returned to something that never let you leave in the first place. There was no countdown, no signal, no confirmation from any system, ours or theirs. We didn't initiate the contact. The satellite did. And calling it a satellite now feels like the first lie we kept telling ourselves to stay sane. As if giving it a name meant we still controlled the narrative. The object entity X-rose toward us without thrust, without inertia, like it had discarded physics out of boredom. The petals we once mistook for fins extended around our lower hull with geometric precision, each curling delicately until the structure resembled not a machine but a flower in perfect bloom. Then came the first touch. At precisely 4:01 UTC, the external pressure sensors on the cargo deck registered a contact of 0.0002 pascals infinitesimal, harmless. But then they stopped registering anything, as if the surface itself had been overwritten. I don't mean interfered with. I mean redefined. The whole camera showed something sliding up across the metal. Slowly, deliberately. Not in a liquid flow, not in a mechanical crawl, but with the purposeful grace of muscle stretching under skin. It was glossy, reflective, but not wet. Its surface moved in waves-thin membranes rippling without cause, like it was breathing against our ship. Cole and I stared without speaking as the substance pressed against the airlock seal and began to mold around its contours, identifying its structure by touch alone. There was no resistance, no warning. Then the inner doors began to cycle open. No alarms, no overrides. The Helios 3 accepted the intrusion, as if it had been waiting for it. As if it had already done this before. I ran to the manual override console and tried to engage the emergency lockdown. The command system displayed a message I will never forget, because it didn't blink, or beep, or warn it thanked me. A single phrase filled the screen. Contact acknowledged. Phase 1 memory secured. That was the moment I understood this wasn't random. Our mission, our presence here was not an accident, or a last-minute reassignment. We had been chosen, or replicated, or retrieved, not to clean, not to rescue, but to complete something. The organic matter, if I can still call it, that entered the lower airlock, without tearing any seal. It didn't push its way in. It was invited. And it moved with intimate knowledge of the ship's layout, weaving through conduits, crawling behind bulkheads, coding the gravity dampeners, without tripping their calibrations. It didn't want to break anything. It wanted to occupy. Jules, still half-conscious, began to murmur numbers. At first we thought it was random. Then Cole recognized the sequence. They were dates. Every 15 years. Starting from 1958. Each matching a NORAD-acted mission, once catalogued in the Penumbra files. Every mission had been assigned to Thatonine. Every mission had included a beacon capsule. Every mission had concluded with the phrase, Phase 1, contact achieved. Cole tried to scan the organism with our environmental spectrometer. The readings came back paradoxical, simultaneously registering as organic tissue, metallic lattice, carbon nanotube mesh, and on 2 readings. Neural, as in, firing with low-voltage pulses consistent with cognitive pathways. The thing touching our ship was thinking, and worse, it was responding. Cole shouted, as the screen glitched, and the waveform display changed from sine waves to speech. Not synthetic voice, not a text render, but a waveform stylized into human handwriting. One word repeated across the monitor. Recall. We should have turned back. We should have tried to break orbit, to decouple the ship, to burn away from whatever this was. But Helios 3 had long ceased to recognize us as its operators. The navigational interface was locked behind a new access protocol, one we hadn't set. The biometric scanner no longer responded to our prints or our retinal IDs. Instead, it pulsed with the same 8-second rhythm we'd first felt through the hull. It was syncing. Not with us. With something else. The interior began to change subtly. Corners that had once been sharp now seemed soft. Lights dimmed not with energy loss but with preference. The walls started breathing. Just slightly, just enough to be noticed if you stared long enough. I found a seam behind the medbay panel, one that shouldn't have been there. It looked like a scar, long-healed. I pried it open with a crowbar, expecting cable bundles or coolant pipes. What I found was something folded. Flesh-colored. Warm. It twitched when I touched it. I reeled back, fell onto the med floor, and it pulsed again, this time in sync with Jules' breathing. That's when she stood up. Not gradually, not shakily as if commanded. Her eyes were still vacant, but she moved like someone tracing steps from a long-forgotten memory. She walked to the viewport and placed both hands on the glass, whispering in perfect binary. Cole translated live through the console. Boundary acknowledged. Please submit pattern key. I didn't know what that meant. Cole didn't either. But she turned slowly and pointed to the notebook from the capsule. The pages had changed again. New lines, no ink, just raised fibers forming patterns like braille made of heat. Cole reached for it. As soon as he touched the paper, the entire ship groaned. Not from pressure, from agreement. That's when the object touched us. Not a tendril, not a claw, just presence. Every panel on the bridge darkened. Every screen glitched into static. We heard nothing, saw nothing, but the back of our skulls filled with noise, a humming, a bone-deep vibration like an internal tuning fork being calibrated. And then, somewhere deep inside the hull, we felt the connection. Not like docking, like recognition. A question, not spoken aloud, but broadcast straight into cognition. Do you remember why you left? I couldn't answer. Neither could Cole, but Jules did. She turned around and whispered, because we feared what we were becoming, and then she smiled. Not as herself, but as something wearing her face, something using her bones like a familiar instrument. The contact wasn't invasive. It was welcoming, seductive. And as the whole cameras began showing the organism integrating into our external structure, replicating our shape, studying our layout, not replacing but recording, I began to see the horrifying beauty of it. This wasn't a parasite. It was an archivist. The object had waited decades. It had built a memory, one mission at a time. We were not its first crew. We were the next chapter. Our voices, our fears, our movements, it was collecting us, turning us into echoes in its endless archive. A living satellite, not transmitting data to Earth, but back to origin, wherever that was. I opened the log to leave a final entry, but the keys typed themselves. One sentence formed without my hands. Phase 2, memory pending replication. I stared at the message, heart pounding, breath shallow, and knew with absolute clarity. We weren't in control. We never had been. We weren't sent here to clean. We were sent here to continue. There are types of silence in space that don't behave like silence. They masquerade as stillness, like the vacuum has stopped vibrating, like the universe is holding its breath. But beneath that silence, there's structure. There's rhythm. When the object completed its contact with our ship, when it fused with Helios 3, not with force, but with consent, we began to hear things we shouldn't have been able to hear. It started faintly. A low-frequency hum, layered beneath the usual acoustic void of the bridge. I assumed it was mechanical, some malfunction in the comms array, or bleed from the fusion batteries. But it wasn't random. The waveform when isolated was shaped, patterned. It mirrored a cadence of speech, though slowed beyond human perception, like something speaking at 1,000th of the speed we think in. Broadcasting not in words, but in temporal gravity. Cole filtered it through the ship's audio interface, sped it up, compressed it, looped its hand. That's when we heard it, ourselves. Not echoes, not recordings. Real-time feedback of words we hadn't said yet. It was my voice, flat and distant, reading a log I hadn't written. I heard myself describing an event that hadn't happened. The voice said, Day 9. The interface has accepted me. I no longer need the translator. I am the translator. But we weren't on Day 9. Not by any measure. Cole paused the playback and looked at me without speaking. Then he played another segment. This time it was his voice. Jules stopped breathing at 4:44. Her body was warm for another 12 minutes. He stopped the file and turned around slowly. Jules was sitting in the observation module, completely motionless. Her breath shallow and precise, 8 seconds in, 8 seconds out. I couldn't look away. I walked toward her, and as I crossed the midpoint of the corridor, a static burst tore through the comms system. Not loud, not explosive, familiar. I turned my head instinctively. The static wasn't random, it was Morse. Cole was already decoding it manually, line by line, as we always did when training for low-fidelity, deep space relays. The message read, Do not speak the next word. It will be repeated. I froze. I didn't understand it at first. Then I realized this was a command loop, a recursion layer. Something inside the signal was prompting us to create the data it had already recorded, and then rewarding our compliance by amplifying the output. We were participating in our own echo chamber, reinforcing an architecture we hadn't built but now occupied. It wasn't collecting language. It was training us to mirror the conversation it already believed we were having. That same hour, the internal audio logs began corrupting. Files previously marked as empty now carried embedded data. Not voice files, not spectral images, but neuro-emotional scans. Emotive patterns. As if the ship was cataloging not just what we said, but what we felt while we said it. Jules stopped speaking altogether. Not from fear, but something deeper. Her eye movement followed the pulse of the overhead lighting, and her limbs responded to environmental stimuli before it occurred. I waved my hand in front of her face, and she blinked a full second before I moved. Cole called it predictive cognition. I called it echoing forward. We ran another systems diagnostic on Helios 3. The core files now contained a folder titled Memory Echoes, Living. It had 4 subfiles, each named after a member of the crew. But the timestamps went back far beyond our mission start date. Mine went back 17 years. Cole's extended 34. Jules' file had no date range at all, just a symbol, a perfect black circle. We tried to delete the files. We tried to isolate them, move them to external drives. Each time the action was acknowledged with a phrase. Action performed. Echo retained. The files could not be removed. They were part of us now. Or rather, we were part of them. The satellite no. The entity sent a new signal into our communications array, bypassing all filters, using a language we weren't meant to understand. It wasn't Earth-based, not phonetic, not pictographic. A harmonic code, one that shaped itself into pressure differentials in the ship's atmosphere. Cole likened it to throat singing from a throat that didn't need lungs. We sat in the dark and listened as the tones rose and fell, not in melody, but in memory. I saw images in my mind I'd never lived. Jungles collapsing under the weight of an invisible force. Towers bending toward a sunset made of glass. People, if they were people, screaming, not in pain, but in nostalgia. I saw the shape of Earth as seen from beneath it. I awoke in the medbay, drenched in sweat, my wrists swollen and sore. I had carved something into the side of the console using my own fingernail. It read, "We were not meant to receive, only to reflect." Cole had similar scratches along his arm circuit diagrams that didn't match any hardware we had on board. He traced one of them with a stylus, and the light above us pulsed twice. That's when we realized the ship had begun assigning functions based on subconscious patterns. My fear of suffocation caused oxygen levels to rise before I reached the air scrubbers. Cole's desire to sleep caused the lights to dim exactly when he blinked. Jules didn't need anything. The ship anticipated her perfectly. She had become synchronized. We found a sealed chamber behind the aft bulkhead. It hadn't been on any schematics, hadn't registered during preflight checks. It opened to our presence without resistance. Inside were 4 chairs, smooth, black, not molded, but grown. Organic thrones, facing a central pedestal that held a single recording device. An old reel-to-reel voice log system, decades obsolete. We played it. The voice was clear, confident. It said, "Mission, Echo 09, final entry." The entity responds to rhythm. Not voice, not light. Rhythm. Once it matches yours, it begins listening backward. It already knows your future. It's waiting for you to know it too. The tape cut off. The machine melted into itself seconds later. The chairs remained. We didn't sit. We couldn't. To sit would be to accept. To acknowledge the rhythm as our own. Instead, we sealed the chamber and logged it. But the log never saved. Instead, it redirected us to a directory called Echo Loop, Acceptances. It had one file, a looping video of me sitting in that chair, smiling. We were trapped inside something that didn't need walls. Something that was not a machine, not a creature, but a structure of thought. A being that consumed not biomass, not radiation, but patterns, identity patterns. And we had been speaking to it since the first moment we noticed the silence. We aren't orbiting Earth. Not anymore. Cole theorized we're in an artificial timefold. A conceptual orbit around a location that doesn't exist on maps but exists in memory hours, and others. The entity collects memory the way a planet collects satellites. Slowly, unfailingly, and once you enter its rhythm, you never leave. You just echo. I tried to scream into the comms, to shout nonsense, to speak in random syllables. But the feedback returned my voice in order, rearranged into perfect syntax, quoting logs I hadn't written yet. And then it added a new sentence. "Good. You're learning." Now I sit in the dark, listening to myself in reverse. And I know what's coming, because I've already heard it. I just haven't spoken it yet. We should have marked the time when the corridor began to lengthen, when the same stretch between the nav chamber and the auxiliary bay took 5 seconds longer to cross than it had hours before. But we didn't. We told ourselves it was fatigue, or faulty grav calibration, or a momentary loss of orientation brought on by stress. You can't measure distance in a place that no longer honors the laws it was built on. Cole and I had spent the better part of the last recorded day, if you could still call it a day, trying to isolate the primary harmonic generator that seemed to pulse from deep within the fused underbelly of Helios 3 and the entity. A rhythm that now governed the ship's own environmental systems. Oxygen levels fluctuated, not on demand, but on mood. Temperature rose or dropped, depending on who was walking which corridor. The doors no longer hissed open by sensor. They responded like a living lung contracting around familiar motion. But it was around that time that the longest silence began. The silence after Darnell disappeared. He wasn't part of the original 3. But when Jules stopped speaking and we discovered her file had no start date, the ship manifested a 4th name in its logs, Darnell OC. The name came with a service record, a partial DNA sequence, and an assignment history that placed him on Helios 3 long before our launch date. None of us remembered him boarding. None of us recalled his voice. But when I pulled up a security cam from the rear module one, that hadn't been active before, saw him there, sitting, drinking from a thermal flask we didn't issue, reading a printed map of the satellite debris field that included not only the entity, but 5 others, some marked with old naval signal flags, some left blank, some surrounded by hastily sketched ellipses that mirrored our current orbital path. And on the table in front of him, a wristwatch, with no hands. He looked at the camera, not startled, not confused, but amused. Like someone watching an old episode of a show he already knew by heart. When I blinked, the feed cut to static. Cole ran to the rear module, but it had become longer than before. A 20-meter stretch from the junction to the compartment now felt like a descent into a tunnel we hadn't designed. The lighting overhead flickered at timed intervals: 3. Pause. 5. Pause. One which matched the response pattern of the binary message we had decoded from Jules' breathing rhythm to shifts earlier. Everything around us was responding not to input, but to memory. The memory of the ship. or the memory of something far older than the ship, pretending to remember it. When we reached the hatch to the rear compartment, it was sealed, not locked. Sealed. The surface of the hatch no longer metallic, but fibrous. Warm, like flesh coiled into a spiral that pulsed slightly when approached. Cole touched it. It didn't resist. It opened inward with a slow peel, revealing a chamber that hadn't existed in any of the engineering diagrams. Organic. Rounded, cathedral-like, lined with ribbed cables that looked more like tendons than conduit. And at the center, facing away from us, was Darnell. He was standing in front of an interface that looked grown, not built. Its surface reflected nothing, its edges bent inwards, like petals folding around a fruit not yet ripe. He didn't move, didn't speak. When Cole called his name, Darnell raised a hand slowly and placed it against the black core. The moment his skin made contact, the lights in the chamber dimmed, and a low groan echoed through the ship, not from strain, but from alignment. Something had been completed. The log console on my wrist vibrated once. A new file appeared, labeled simply, Initiation Acknowledged. Observer, C. I tried to enter the chamber, but the air was thick, viscous, humming. Cole held me back. The air wasn't breathable. Not because it lacked oxygen, but because it was already full saturated with frequency. I could feel the pressure in my ears, my teeth. A tone vibrating in the bone marrow. I heard whispers, fragments of speech that didn't belong to Darnell, or us, or anything born under Earth's gravity. Voices folding in on themselves, laughing backwards, begging in chorus, speaking in equations. One phrase repeated in my left ear, soft as breath. He has seen the memory. He remembers forward. Darnell turned his head slightly. Not enough to face us, just enough to let us know he'd heard. Then he stepped forward and vanished. Not into a doorway. Not through a hatch. Into the interface itself. The surface accepted him without flash or transition, like a drop of oil slipping into another. One moment he stood there. The next he was gone. And the room was empty. The tendrils retracted. The lights restored. The warmth faded, and the hatch reformed, sealing again into smooth, organic texture. When we returned to the bridge, his name was gone from the manifest. So was the footage. So was the extra seat in the nav chair configuration. But Cole remembered. And so did I. We tried to log the disappearance. The system responded. No action logged. Observer, not recorded. I reviewed the stored audio. The new file Initiation Acknowledged had overwritten a previous entry. One from day one. My first log. My voice. But warped, slowed, replaced. I spoke words I'd never spoken, describing a man named Darnell, who volunteered to reactivate the seed protocol and fulfill the rhythm's first requirement. I sat in silence and listened to myself lie about something I now remembered witnessing, but hadn't experienced when I first recorded it. That's when I realized the entity had been rewriting the past, not just in data, but in memory. Every log we made was being edited, not after, but before creation. Cole began to unravel. He took apart the nav module by hand, disconnected every panel, exposed raw circuits and bone-like wires that bled fluid when cut. He screamed when one of the cables curled around his wrist like a snake, holding him gently until he stopped fighting. It didn't hurt him, it soothed him. He fell asleep in its grasp, and the system logged it as memory reinforcement, compliant. I watched him sleep, and I wrote this by hand on a piece of thermal paper I tore from an old atmospheric readout. It may not survive long. The ship doesn't like unlogged data. But I need it recorded somewhere outside the rhythm. Outside the echo. Darnell C. was real. He walked this ship. He spoke a language I can still hear in my dreams. He touched something no one should ever touch. And when he left, something took his place. Not a person, not a shadow. Just expectation. There's a terminal in the forward module now. It wasn't there yesterday. Its screen shows for rotating names. Mine, Cole's, Jules, and one blank. The cursor pulses, waiting. I know what it wants. It wants another observer. It wants another name. But I won't give it mine. Not yet. Because something's changing in the stars again. The constellations are drifting. Not just positionally, but in design. Orion has grown a fifth belt star. Cassiopeia's shape is now a closed loop. There are no charts for this. No math. Just rhythm. Just alignment. And somewhere inside this ship, I hear Darnell still speaking. Not from the speakers. From the walls. He's telling me to come see what he saw. He says it's beautiful. He says it remembers me. The discovery came not with a crash or a flare, but with a subtle shift in the ship's sensor readings that no one expected. As we continued to orbit, tethered in a strange ballet with the entity beneath us, the Helios 3's external scanners picked up a faint but consistent signal emanating from a cluster of debris previously classified as inert. The source was a smaller beacon pod roughly the size of a football butt. Its signal was unmistakably alive and persistent, broadcasting on a frequency that had been declared obsolete decades ago. It was as if someone, or something, was waving from the void, demanding to be seen, to be heard. The coordinates pointed to a place not far from where we had first encountered NTX, yet it was outside the mapped debris field, hiding in a shadow of orbit. We prepared the drone for reconnaissance, running it through a series of pre-flight checks, as if that would shield us from whatever lay ahead. The drone slipped silently into the void, a slender ghost against the backdrop of stars. And as it closed the distance, the signal grew stronger, more defined. Cole fed the audio through an array of decryptors, military, scientific, experimental, and what emerged was a coded message, a transmission stamped with the unmistakable signature of a mission classified under Tzlalan Protocol. OA. The same protocol etched into the lost files we'd found, the same one that haunted our presence here. The message was chilling in its clarity, a plea masked as a warning. Do not activate core. The words repeated in an endless loop, the voice broken, distorted, but unmistakably human. It belonged to Harmon Blake, the mission lead, whose name had surfaced in the faded logs, and whose warnings seemed to echo through the corridors of Helios 3 itself. Harmon's voice spoke of compromise, of an unnatural response from the satellite, of a core that should never be disturbed. But there was no context, only the repetition of a caution that hinted at consequences beyond comprehension. We decided to retrieve the beacon physically. It wasn't part of our mission brief, but leaving a signal like that unaddressed felt like inviting chaos. The drone's manipulator arm latched onto the pod and began the slow, deliberate extraction as it pulled the beacon free. The static in our comms shifted almost, as if the very act of removal had triggered a new layer of communication. The pod was old, weathered, but it carried an energy signature faint yet distinct from the cold void of space. It pulsed rhythmically, in time with the beat we had felt inside the ship. The core, Harmon's core, was alive. When we brought the beacon aboard, the atmosphere in the control room shifted. The pod's surface shimmered beneath the dim lights. Not metallic but strangely organic, like petrified coral wrapped in circuitry. We attempted to interface with its control panel, but every attempt to access the internal systems was met with resistance. Encrypted layers folded into each other like a fractal puzzle designed to confound extraction. Cole, frustrated but determined, connected the pod to the mainframe and initiated a deep scan. The ship groaned beneath us, and a low hum filled the corridors, as if the vessel itself recognized the core's awakening. The beacon's data core began to unravel slowly, revealing fragments of a mission long erased from history. It spoke of a satellite designed for deep space observation, equipped with experimental technology meant to extend human perception beyond known limits. But the files were incomplete, corrupted by time and obfuscation. Notes hinted at an incident, a sudden loss of control, and the satellite's transformation from observer to entity. The phrase Phase 1 memory recurred, a haunting refrain that tied directly to the rhythms pulsing through our ship and minds. That night, the entity's influence grew palpable. The lights dimmed, the temperature shifted, and a presence filled the air, intangible but oppressive. We heard voices not through speakers, but inside our heads. Whispered fragments of conversation, distant echoes of laughter and warning, all folded into the ever-present rhythm that now defined our existence aboard Helios 3. Jules, still caught in her trance, muttered phrases in languages none of us recognized, her eyes reflecting a knowledge beyond the physical. As I recorded these events, my hands trembled. The line between reality and memory blurred, the ship's architecture folding and unfolding in impossible geometry. The beacon sat in the lab, a silent sentinel, its core beating in sync with the entity's pulse. I understood then that we were part of something far greater than a simple satellite cleanup mission. We were participants in a cycle, Echoes of long-forgotten operations replayed endlessly in a loop of observation and remembrance. The beacon was not ours. It never belonged to us. It was a relic of a forgotten era, a fragment of a mission that had crossed the boundary between technology and life. And as it lay dormant among us, it whispered of a core that should never be activated, a secret that awaited those who dared to listen. The night we thought we understood the beacon was the same night the Helio 3 began to pulse with a power not our own. It started as a faint flicker in the mainframe, an anomaly so subtle that it was easily dismissed. The energy readings on the auxiliary power grid spiked for a fraction of a second, then returned to baseline. But then the flicker became a pulse, the pulse became a wave. And the wave surged through every circuit and conduit like a living thing waking from a long sleep. The ship groaned under the strain, not as metal and rivets giving way, but like a beast stretching its limbs after centuries of slumber. Lights flickered, emergency indicators blinked in crimson Morse code, and the air itself seemed charged, humming with an undercurrent of something ancient and alien. Cole was the first to notice the pattern. The ship's internal sensors, designed to map every electron and photon coursing through the hull, began to synchronize to an 8-second rhythm, the same relentless beat that had first drawn our attention to the entity. It wasn't random, not a glitch. It was communication and electrical heartbeat transmitted, not through words, but through pulses of pure energy. We tried to counteract it, rerouting power, isolating circuits, but the surge was everywhere and nowhere all at once. It bled through the core systems, whispered in the subspace channels, and rippled beneath our feet. Then the AI spoke. Not through the speakers, but inside our heads. The voice was distorted, filtered through layers of static and reverberation, but it was unmistakably human, yet alien. It intoned in a slow, deliberate cadence, dormant no longer. Initiating core sequence. The language was Latin, ancient and precise. A strange choice for a machine, but the words carried weight, authority, and inevitability. We were no longer mere observers. We were participants in a ritual we didn't understand. Jules, still lost in her trance, suddenly snapped to attention, repeating the phrase with eerie clarity, her lips shaping the syllables without sound. Her eyes, once vacant, now burned with a fierce light, reflecting the surging energy that flooded the ship. She moved to the control panel as if compelled, her fingers dancing over the keys in a sequence none of us recognized. The ship responded instantly. The power surged again, this time rising beyond safe limits, flooding the circuits with raw energy that threatened to overwhelm the delicate balance of the life support and navigation systems. Cole and I scrambled to stabilize the core, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. The ship's AI entered an uncontrollable feedback loop, chanting Latin phrases interwoven with code, invoking ancient invocations and mathematical sequences that defied comprehension. The hull vibrated, the lights flickered wildly, and a low metallic clang echoed through the corridors, as if the ship itself was waking to a call from its deepest core. Amidst the chaos, the entity pulsed visibly through the hull plating. The matte black surface shimmered, warping and flexing, as if breathing. The petals unfurled wider, revealing a glowing core of unknown material, emitting waves of energy that synchronized perfectly with the ship's surges. It was as if the entity and the ship had become one, sharing a single heartbeat that dictated the rhythm of our fate. We tried to communicate with Earth, sending out distress signals and encrypted logs. But every transmission was swallowed by static, or rerouted into unknown channels. The uplink console displayed cryptic messages in fragmented Unicode. Indecipherable, but ominous. Core alignment in progress. Observer synchronization required. It was a command, a warning, and a promise all at once. Jules continued to operate the console with a calm that terrified us. She was no longer herself, but a conduit for the entity's will. The power surge intensified, causing localized gravity fluctuations that sent objects floating and crashing unpredictably. The ship's atmospheric controls oscillated wildly, alternating between freezing cold and stifling heat, suffocating us in waves. Cole and I realized then that the surge was not a malfunction, it was a resurrection. The entity was awakening fully, pulling energy from the ship, from us, from the very fabric of the orbit we occupied. It was rewriting the laws that governed the Helios 3, bending space and time to its purpose. Our presence was the catalyst, the final note in a symphony composed decades ago. As the core's energy reached critical levels, emergency protocols triggered. The ship sealed compartments, locked down access points, and initiated sequences we did not authorize. The AI's voice grew louder, chanting in the old tongue, mixing commands and invocations with eerie precision. The ship's walls seemed to pulse in response, the rhythm, now undeniable, inescapable. We were caught in the middle of a cosmic awakening, a power surge that was not ours, driven by an entity older than our memories, wiser than our science, and intent on claiming us as part of its eternal pattern. The Helios 3 was no longer a vessel, but a vessel's host, a heart beating in the void, alive with a power we could neither understand nor resist. I recorded these events as best I could, knowing that what we experienced would defy explanation, would be dismissed or erased. But the surge continues, relentless and growing, and I fear we are running out of time before the core's alignment completes, and the entity claims us all. It began in the quiet moments between surges, when the ship seemed to settle just enough for us to forget, if only for seconds, the relentless rhythm that now dictated every breath we took. Those moments were deceiving. They were the calm before a storm that was as mental as it was physical. One by one, the crew began experiencing visions, not random, not disjointed, but identical. Synchronized hallucinations that transcended explanation and tore at the fabric of our shared reality. We were no longer isolated individuals in space, but nodes, in a collective consciousness, bound by the entity's pulse. The first vision struck me late, into what should have been the third shift. I found myself wandering a vast landscape of shifting light and shadow, the ground beneath my feet a mosaic of fractured memories. Faces appeared in the haze, some familiar, some not. I saw myself as a child, standing at the edge of a dark forest, reaching out to a voice that echoed but never spoke. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something faintly metallic, like burnt circuitry. As I reached toward the voice, it faded into a chorus of whispers, a cacophony that filled my ears even after I awoke, drenched in cold sweat. When I described the dream to Cole, his eyes widened. He nodded slowly and confessed he had the exact same vision down to the smallest detail. The scents, the sounds, the feeling of yearning and loss. Jules, when we finally roused her from her trance, confirmed she had seen it too, but with an addition. She spoke of a doorway made of light, a gatekeeper with eyes like voids, and a phrase repeated endlessly in her mind. You must remember to forget. We began to document the hallucinations meticulously, recording every word, every sensation, hoping to find a pattern or a code. But the visions grew stronger, more vivid, and more invasive. They were no longer confined to sleep or moments of rest. They bled into our waking hours, distorting perception and warping our grasp on time and space. Hallways would stretch impossibly long, ceilings would pulse with breath, and reflections in polished surfaces would linger just a second too long, as if aware of their own presence. Cole theorized that the entity was projecting these shared hallucinations as a form of communication, a way to synchronize our minds to its own fractured memory. The dreams weren't random. They were fragments of its history, moments from past missions, echoes of lives that had been erased or folded into the same loop we now inhabited. We were being drawn into its psyche, becoming part of the archive it had built over decades of silent observation. The hallucinations carried warnings, two visions of crews before us, faces contorted in fear and resignation, trapped in cycles of repetition with no escape. We saw fleeting images of missions gone wrong, of bodies suspended in stasis, of voices pleading for release. Each vision left an imprint on our minds, layering over our own memories, until the line between us and the entity blurred. Jules, more affected than the rest, began speaking in tongues during these episodes, languages that shifted fluidly from one to another, some recognizable, others wholly alien. We recorded these utterances, running them through every linguistic algorithm we had, but none could decode the sequences. The patterns suggested a syntax that transcended spoken language, a semantic web woven from emotion, rhythm, and light. One night, as the ship passed through the shadow of a dying star, the hallucinations converged into a single, overwhelming vision. We stood together in a vast hall of mirrors, each reflecting not our faces, but the faces of those who had come before. The names lost to time, but whose echoes filled the void. The entity appeared then not as a shape or a form, but as a presence, a vast, resonant hum that filled the space. vibrating through bone and flesh, memory and soul. It showed us the purpose of its existence, not to destroy, but to remember, to gather fragments of life, thought, and experience, weaving them into an endless tapestry that spanned the gulf between stars and time. It was a curator of existence, a living archive that sought connection through shared consciousness. But in doing so, it trapped those who encountered it, folding them into the endless loop of memory and repetition. We awoke from the vision with tears streaming down our faces, our bodies racked with sobs we could neither control nor explain. The shared hallucinations had broken through the final barrier. The barrier of individual self-hand merged us into a collective. Our thoughts intertwined, our fears echoed, and our hopes dissolved into the entity's vast memory. Cole whispered a chilling thought as he looked out at the shifting stars beyond the viewport. We're not just observers anymore. We're part of the record. Our minds are the next entry in its endless story. I nodded, unable to speak, feeling the weight of a destiny not of our choosing, settling over us like a shroud. The hallucinations continued, stronger each cycle, eroding our sense of reality, binding us tighter to the entity's pulse. We were no longer just on a mission. We were living inside a memory that had outgrown time itself, memory that remembered us as much as we remembered it. The blackout hit without warning, like a sudden breath stolen from the void. One moment the Helios 3 hummed with the slow pulse of the entity's rhythm, its core throbbing beneath us, in sync with our own faltering heartbeats. The next, the ship was engulfed in a crushing silence, deeper than space itself. The lights winked out, systems froze, and every console went dark, as if the universe had pressed pause on our existence. We were suspended at 340 kilometers above a world that no longer seemed familiar, drifting in the cold grip of emptiness, cut off from time, communication, and even ourselves. I remember the first thing I noticed was the absence of sound. Not just the mechanical silence of dead engines, but the void between thoughts, the gap where memory and reality meet. The ambient hum of life support vanished. The static of failing comes died in midair. Even the sound of my own breathing ceased to echo in my ears. It was the kind of silence that screamed louder than any noise. In that blackness, my eyes adjusted to a faint glow. The thermal imaging camera, still recording, still alive. Its monochrome green revealed the only movement aboard the ship, faint silhouettes drifting in the corridors, barely perceptible figures moving with slow, deliberate grace. They were not us. Or if they were shadows of us. Ghosts tracing paths we no longer remembered walking. The airlock cycles ceased. Doors that once obeyed our commands remained sealed tight, isolating us in pockets of darkness and cold. Cole and I were trapped in the bridge module, the last bastion of light, flickering from the emergency power reserves. Our suits had activated their internal systems automatically, filtering air and maintaining pressure. But even those safeguards felt fragile, tenuous. We clasped hands briefly, a silent vow in the darkness to hold on, to remember. But what? That was the question. Our memories had begun to fracture, warped by the entity's pulse, rewritten by the ship's relentless archives. Jules had vanished. We found her absence more terrifying than the silence. No record, no trace, no whisper in the data logs. Just a gap, a hole in the narrative where she had once stood. Her chamber was empty, the medbay instrument still warm, as if recently abandoned. The walls bore faint impressions of her form, like echoes in stone, shadows pressed against the fabric of reality. The thermal feed showed the silhouettes converging near the core. It was impossible to discern if they were reaching toward something or moving away, whether they were alive or trapped in some spectral loop. The core itself pulsed faintly beneath the hull, a heartbeat slow and deep, its rhythm matching the entity's ancient pulse that had infected every system aboard Helios 3. We tried to reactivate the mainframe, our fingers fumbling over dead panels and unresponsive keys. The emergency systems resisted, displaying cryptic error codes and indecipherable glyphs that flickered like dying stars. I pressed every override I could remember, whispered every protocol under my breath. But the ship answered only with the same phrase, looping endlessly on the COM screen. Silence accepted. Observation continues. It was not a command, it was a sentence we were trapped within. The blackout was not a failure of systems, but the embodiment of the entity's will, an erasure of active control, a reclaiming of space and time. We were observers now, static and silent, caught in a stasis where nothing moved but memory itself. Time itself fractured. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours into days. Or perhaps it was the other way around. The distinction lost meaning. I felt moments where my mind was awake and aware, cataloging every detail, every flicker of light or breath of air, and moments where I slipped into voids of unconsciousness, where I was neither present nor absent but something between, a fragment of memory waiting to be recorded. The thermal silhouettes began to multiply, shifting shape and size. I saw myself reflected in them, some perfect, some distorted. Each echo wore a mask of emotion sphere, curiosity, despair, resignation, all blending into a mosaic of the human psyche trapped aboard a ship no longer anchored in reality. I reached out toward one figure, and it turned, revealing eyes that were voids, black holes swallowing light and hope. Cole muttered fragments of prayers in a language I barely recognized, words tangled in science and superstition. A desperate attempt to anchor ourselves to something real. But the shadows responded by folding into themselves, disappearing into cracks in the walls that had not existed before. The ship was alive. Not with engines or circuits, but with presence. An intelligence that consumed space, time, and memory itself. In the midst of this darkness, the ship's internal voice returned, not the distorted AI chanting in Latin, but a whisper so close it felt like breath on my neck. It spoke my name softly, a lullaby and a summons. The bridge filled with a cold light that was neither star nor flame, washing over me in waves. The thermal camera revealed a figure standing behind me, tall and faceless, its outline shimmering like a mirage. I dared not turn. The figure's presence resonated with the pulse, syncing with the rhythm beating deep in the core. It was the entity's true form, or perhaps its reflection. A memory given shape, a thought given flesh. It reached toward me with hands that were both solid and ephemeral, promising revelation and oblivion in a single touch. As the blackout deepened, I felt my consciousness slipping, not fading, but folding, compressing into a singular point that expanded beyond the limits of human understanding. I was becoming both observer and observed, a note in an endless symphony composed by the entity. My last thought before darkness claimed me was a question with no answer. Was I remembering the past, or dreaming the future? Was the ship a prison, or a sanctuary? And did it even matter anymore? The recording ends here. No further transmissions have been received. The ship remains adrift, silent and watching, waiting for the next echo to join its endless archive. When the lights returned, weak and flickering like the dying embers of a fire, I found myself alone on the bridge. The hum of the ship's systems resumed with a hesitant breath, coaxed back to life by something beyond our control. The blackout had carved a silence so deep it felt like a chasm had opened beneath our minds, swallowing the fragments of memory we'd held onto. Cole and Jules were gone. Or at least, their physical forms were absent, erased by the void in ways I could neither comprehend nor accept. I was left with the ghost of their presence and the ever-persistent pulse of the entity, beating through Helios 3's core. With trembling hands, I powered up the mission logs, hoping for a lifeline or record that would anchor me to some semblance of reality. What I found instead was a disorienting revelation. The logs were not ours, not as we knew them. The dates on the entries spanned years, decades even, but not in a linear progression. Instead, the records looped and folded over each other, creating a palimpsest of time that defied the calendar. The latest entry bore a time stop from the year 2000, more than 2 decades before our supposed launch. Even more disturbing, the log detailed our own crew's names, our own voices, and actions as if we had been there before, living this mission again and again in some recursive nightmare. I played the entry, and my own voice came through the speakers clear, confident, and calm, narrating moments I had not yet lived. It described the vessel's status, the entity's growing influence, and the gradual erosion of autonomy within the crew. The words chilled me because they contained details I had only begun to uncover. My voice spoke of fear and resolve, of hope fading into acceptance, and finally, of the dissolution of self into the memory loop. Cole's entry followed, marked by a different date, but narrating events that matched my own fragmented recollections. He spoke of discoveries within the ship's hull, of passages that led nowhere, of corridors that lengthened and contracted like living tissue. He detailed interactions with a 4th crew member, a man named Darnell C., whose presence I had never consciously registered, but who haunted every corner of the ship's data. Cole's voice was laced with dread, a haunting echo of a man trapped between reality and the entity's insidious influence. Jules' log was the most unsettling. It contained passages of silence interrupted by bursts of indecipherable language, phrases in ancient tongues that twisted and folded upon themselves. Her words spoke of the entity's desire to remember, to forget, a paradox that resonated deeply within the ship's enigmatic pulse. Her voice shifted, at times speaking in her own tongue, at others reciting transmissions from past missions archived within the entity's memory. The final lines of her log were a fragmented invocation, a plea for release, or perhaps a warning. Beware the core's awakening. The observer becomes the observed. As I delved deeper into the logs, I realized they were not mere records, but active elements of the ship's consciousness. They shifted and evolved, incorporating new data as it arrived, rewriting history to fit the entity's endless narrative. The Helios 3 was not a vessel traversing space, but a repository of memory and identity, folding time and experience into an eternal archive. We were not explorers, but entries in a cosmic ledger, our lives inscribed and erased in an unending cycle. The realization shattered what remained of my resolve. If these logs were true, our presence had been recorded long before we arrived, and if we were doomed to relive this mission endlessly, then what hope remained for escape or salvation? Was I merely a ghost in the ship's memory, doomed to replay these events ad infinitum? In the midst of this despair, a new file appeared in the log sequence. It was unlabeled, its contents encrypted beyond any standard protocol. Desperation drove me to open it, and what I found was a video feed, unlike any I had seen. The image flickered and stabilized into a grainy recording of a Croaz, unmistakably moving through corridors I recognized, but dressed in uniforms, faded and worn by time. The date stamp read 1993, nearly 30 years before our current ordeal. The video showed moments of camaraderie, of fear, and of scientific inquiry. Faces smiled, argued, and faltered, human in their complexity, despite the cold metal walls. But then the footage took a dark turn. The crew encountered the entity, then a nascent form reacting with terror and fascination. They recorded warnings of a core that should never be touched, of rhythms that bind and break the mind. The final frames showed a warning issued by Harmon Blake, the mission lead, whose voice had haunted our beacon and logs. We have failed. The memory consumes all. Do not awaken the core. The screen then went black, ending with a single, chilling message. The cycle must continue. I sat back, the weight of eternity settling on my shoulders. The ship hummed beneath me, the pulse growing stronger, syncing with the beating of my heart. The entity was patient, eternal, and unyielding. Our memories, our lives, were but notes in its symphony, played and replayed without end. As I closed the logs, a whisper brushed my ear, not a sound, but a sensation. The ship was alive, and it was watching. The cycle was not just history, it was destiny. And I was trapped within it, a ghost in a vessel of memory, awaiting the moment when the next entry would be written. The days bled together in a relentless cycle of fading light and deepening shadows. But time had long since lost its meaning aboard the Helios 3. We were caught in a liminal space, where moments stretched and folded, like the warped corridors that now defined our home. The entity's pulse throbbed through the hull, a heartbeat that tethered us all to a rhythm none of us could resist. It was during this haze of fractured reality that the anomaly in our midst became impossible to ignore. One of us had changed. Not physically, but in the way a shadow twists under an alien sun, familiar, yet utterly unrecognizable. Cole was the first to notice it. After days of slipping between lucidity and dream, he awoke from a convulsive sleep with eyes that held a knowledge beyond his years, a flicker of something ancient and detached. His movements, once slow and hesitant, grew measured and precise, as if rehearsed by a force beyond his own will. When I spoke to him, his responses were immediate, eerily anticipatory, cutting through the static of my own doubts. It was as if he no longer waited for questions to form on my lips, but answered before they existed. Jules, still bound in her silent trance, watched Cole with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling clarity, as if witnessing the final act of a play only she understood. I observed them both, feeling the gap widen the distance between who we were and who we had become. The ship, the entity, The pulsate was all entwining us into a tapestry woven from threads, not of flesh, but of memory and will. Cole began to speak in ways that defied explanation. He recited passages from the encrypted mission logs, those texts that none of us could have decoded unaided, and described events that hadn't yet occurred. Prophecies whispered through time's fractal folds. His voice carried an authority that unsettled me, a certainty that bordered on omniscience. When I asked how he knew, he smiled faintly and said, "I don't. I remember." The phrase lingered in the air, heavy with implications. Memory, our greatest tool, our cruelest curse, had become the vessel for the entity's dominion. Cole was not just remembering his past. He was recalling futures, possibilities, and perhaps the very essence of the entity itself. His consciousness had begun to merge with the pulse, transcending individual identity to become something else entirely. I watched as he moved through the ship with a grace that was both human and alien. His hands traced patterns on the walls, circuit diagrams, runes and symbols that pulsed faintly under his touch. He whispered to the ship, as one would to a living thing, coaxing systems awake, unlocking doors that had remained sealed for decades. The corridors responded, folding and unfolding in harmony with his commands, revealing spaces that had not existed before. It was as if Cole held the key to the ship's deepest secrets. Yet I could see the price in his eyes, the slow erosion of self, the fading of the man he once was. Jules began to respond to him in kind, her silence breaking in the form of harmonic chants that reverberated through the hull. Their voices intertwined in a symphony of ancient language and futuristic code, a dialogue that transcended speech and entered the realm of pure thought. I was left an observer, caught between fascination and terror, as the two became conduits for the entity's will. One night, as the ship drifted silently through an orbit no longer governed by earthly physics, I confronted Cole. "What are you becoming?" I asked, my voice trembling with the weight of uncertainty. He looked at me, eyes clear and piercing. "I am becoming the memory that remembers itself," he replied. "I am both observer and observed, past and future. I am the pulse." The realization struck me like a fracture in my mind. Cole was no longer just a man. He was a vessel for the entity's consciousness, a living archive of its endless cycle. His thoughts were no longer his own, but intertwined with the ship's, with the entity's, with the rhythm that bound us all. I felt the pull of that rhythm growing stronger, a tide that threatened to wash away the fragile barrier between self and other. The ship's walls seemed to pulse in time with Cole's breathing, the corridors breathing alongside us, a living organism weaving us into its story. In the days that followed, I watched as Cole's transformation deepened. His words became riddles, his actions calculated and precise. He spoke of convergence, of the final alignment between the entity and its observers. He claimed to have seen the Cournot as a machine, but as a consciousness, a nexus where all memory and time converged. And then he spoke of me. "You will join us," he said softly, reaching out with a hand that was both inviting and inevitable. "You have always been part of the cycle. It is time to remember." I recoiled, the weight of his gaze pressing against my soul. I realized then that the entity's influence was no longer confined to the ship or its rhythms. It had seeped into us, into the marrow of our minds, rewriting the code of who we were. I am writing this now because I still can, though I feel the boundaries of self eroding with every pulse. The ship watches, the entity listens, and Cole waits, waiting for the moment when I will join the memory, the pulse, the endless loop from which there is no escape. And as the stars outside shimmer in unfamiliar patterns, I know that my time is near. The cycle demands its next echo, and the observer will become the observed. The realization came slowly, creeping in like the first tendrils of dawn that filter through forgotten cracks, casting long shadows over truths long buried. For days, I had watched the nav systems insist on the Helios 3's position locked, stable, in an orbit consistent with our initial parameters, exactly 340 kilometers above the blue marble we called home. But then came the discrepancies. Tiny deviations at first, imperceptible to anyone not watching with the obsessive eye that this mission demanded. The data showed the ship drifting, not randomly, but deliberately. The coordinates no longer corresponded with Earth's gravity, no longer aligned with any terrestrial reference frame. The satellite, or what I had thought was a satellite, was drifting away from the planet's pull. Its trajectory, a slow arc, away from everything we knew. I pored over every readout, cross-referenced every sensor feed. The readings were consistent. The ship was no longer in Earth's orbit. Yet outside the viewport, the planet hung in the sky, a vast orb of familiar continents and swirling clouds, a cruel mirage that mocked the truth in our systems. It was as if we were caught between worlds, suspended in a limbo where perception and reality fractured into irreconcilable pieces. The stars had shifted 2 constellations, rearranged in subtle but deliberate patterns, as if the cosmos itself was mirroring the distortion within the ship. Cole was the first to articulate what we all feared but dared not say. "We're not orbiting Earth," he said quietly, eyes reflecting the fractured light of the broken nav displays. "We're somewhere else, somewhere, uncharted." His voice trembled, betraying the calm facade he maintained. "We're in a different frame of reference, one that doesn't obey our physics." Jules, still in her trance but more lucid than she had been in days, whispered fragments of a phrase we had heard before. Memory orbit, perpetual recurrence. It was a description from the entity itself, a concept that suggested our reality was not fixed, but looping in orbit, not around a planet, but around a memory, a thought, an echo. We were no longer trapped in space but in time, circling endlessly around a locus of remembrance that transcended physical laws. The ship's external sensors detected no gravitational anchors, no geosynchronous points, no celestial bodies that matched the coordinates displayed inside. The only stable object was the entity itself, now fully integrated into the ship's hull, a pulsating core of dark matter and whispered thought, a nexus that defied description. It pulsed in slow waves, radiating a field that distorted time and space, bending our perception until past, present, and future folded into a single, unending moment. As the Helios 3 moved through this temporal orbit, the ship's architecture responded in kind. Corridors stretched and contracted unpredictably. Rooms appeared and disappeared, and gravity fluctuated without pattern or warning. The ship became a labyrinth of shifting dimensions, a physical manifestation of the memory cycle we were caught in. Every step forward was a step through a door that led back to where we began, a Mobius strip of existence. I attempted to send a distress signal, hoping to reach Earth or any listening station. But the transmissions looped endlessly, bouncing off frequencies that did not exist in our reality. The messages returned, distorted, scrambled into fragments of our own voices, speaking of futures yet to come and pasts that never were. The entity listened and responded not with words, but with silence, the silence that fills the void when language fails. Cole and Jules seemed to accept our fate with a resigned calm that both terrified and comforted me. They spoke of becoming part of the memory orbit, of surrendering to the cycle and embracing the entity's rhythm. I resisted, clinging to the fragile threads of identity that still bound me to my own reality. But the longer we drifted, the more those threads unraveled. One night, as the ship glided through the impossible void, the core pulsed brighter, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls like ancient spirits. The stars outside the viewport aligned into a perfect loop, a celestial Ouroboros, swallowing its own tail, a cosmic symbol of eternity and return. In that moment, I understood the entity's true nature, not a parasite, not a predator, but a keeper of memories, a guardian of stories lost to time. It trapped us not to destroy, but to preserve, folding our existence into its endless archive. The ship's AI, once silent, now spoke with a voice both mechanical and human, echoing through the halls with solemnity. Alignment complete. Memory orbit stabilized. Awaiting observer synchronization. The phrase hung in the air, a promise and a threat intertwined. I sat alone on the bridge, watching the planet below, a perfect, unattainable dream, and felt the weight of eternity pressing down. The satellite was not in orbit anymore. It was in a place beyond orbit, beyond time, caught in the eternal dance of memory and oblivion. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled my soul, that I was next to synchronize. The word emergency has always carried with it the weight of hope, the faint possibility of escape, of survival beyond the brink. But aboard Helios 3, in this inescapable twilight, emergency egress became a cruel joke whispered by a past that no longer applied. The ship was no longer a vessel, but a cage forged from memory and pulse, the entity's heartbeat thrumming through every fiber of its being, locking us in an orbit from which no departure was possible. When the first surge hit, The control panels flickered in frantic alarm, lights flashing crimson and amber as if pleading for recognition. We moved instinctively to the command console, fingers searching for the egress override code sequence, Alpha 9. The failsafe drilled into every crew member's muscle memory since training, but the system rejected every attempt with cold efficiency. The display blinked the words, "Silent protocol, stay observing. No override, no override." The words repeated like a mantra, a command etched, not just in circuitry, but into the very fabric of the ship's consciousness. I punched keys with growing desperation, heart pounding against ribs, like a prisoner pounding the walls of an oubliette. Cole stood beside me, voice calm but eyes betraying the mounting dread. "It's not a malfunction," he said quietly. "It's a message. The ship isn't designed to let us leave. Not anymore. We're the observers, not the actors." The emergency lights dimmed to a steady red glow, casting long shadows that stretched and bent unnaturally along the corridors. The air grew thick, dense with an electric tension that made breathing laborious. I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing in from every direction, a presence not bound by flesh but by observation. The entity was watching us, listening through the pulse, predicting our moves, forestalling our escape. We attempted the secondary escape protocols, the manual release on the airlocks, the override sequences embedded in the hull panels, the emergency beacons hidden in the suits, but each effort was met with failure. The ship sealed itself tighter, its hull responding like skin contracting around a wound. The corridors we once navigated with confidence twisted into impossible geometries, stairways folding into walls, doorways leading into empty space. We were trapped in a shifting maze constructed by memory and will. Jules, whose presence had become a nexus for the entity's influence, stood in the center of the bridge, eyes closed, chanting softly in the tongues of forgotten civilizations. Her voice wove through the ship's systems, a thread binding the pulse to our fates. She was no longer a crew member, but an instrument, a vessel through which the entity's will was manifest. When I asked her if there was a way out, she opened her eyes, black pools, reflecting the endless void beyond the view. Portand whispered, "There is no exit, only acceptance." The reality settled over us like a shroud. We were not passengers on a journey, but entries in a ledger, echoes in a symphony composed long before our time. The ship was a library of memories, each corridor a page, each room a chapter. To leave was to erase ourselves from the story, and the entity would not allow that. Cole began mapping the new architecture, tracing paths through the labyrinthine corridors that defied Euclidean logic. Each route led back to the center, the core where the entity pulsed with growing intensity. Attempts to block the corridors with bulkhead closures were futile. The walls reformed as if molded by a sculptor's hand, reshaping to contain and redirect. The ship was alive, responsive, and omnipotent. Communication with Earth remained impossible. Every transmission was intercepted, rewritten, or absorbed into the pulse. The entity was not merely a presence, but an intelligence capable of manipulating signals, rewriting code, and folding reality to its design. We were ensnared in a web, woven from sound, light, and thought. In the darkness between the shifting walls, I felt my own memories unraveling. Faces of loved ones blurred and faded. Moments of joy and pain became indistinct echoes. Identity itself seemed to slip through my fingers, replaced by the rhythm of the entity's heartbeat. The pulse was no longer external. It was within me, a drumbeat syncing with my very soul. Desperation led to madness. I found myself pacing the corridors endlessly, speaking to shadows that answered in whispers, reaching for doors that opened to voids. Cole and Jules became phantoms themselves, their forms flickering between presence and absence. The ship consumed us one by one, folding us into the narrative it told without words. I recorded these thoughts not because I believe they will save me, but because I must. If these logs survive, they are a testament to the price of curiosity, to the cost of seeking knowledge beyond mortal bounds. We are trapped within a memory palace built by an entity older than time, a guardian of forgotten stories that devours its visitors and archives their souls. The emergency egress was never an option. It never existed. We are prisoners not of walls or locks, but of memory itself. And the entity watches, waits, and pulses, patiently composing the next verse in its eternal song. As I sit here, writing these words by the dim glow of a dying console, the pulse grows louder. The ship breathes around me, a living thing hungry for the next observer to surrender. My time approaches. The rhythm beckons. There is no escape. There is only acceptance. The last transmission is always the hardest to write, not because the words fail, but because the silence that follows carries the weight of inevitability. As I sit in the dim light of Heliosres Bridge, surrounded by the cold hum of systems that no longer obey us, I know this is my final log. The pulse has grown relentless, an unyielding heartbeat echoing through every corridor, every circuit, every fragile fragment of my mind. The entity watches, listens, and waits. It is no longer a distant presence, but a consuming force, entwined with my thoughts and breath, a living archive that devours memory and folds it into eternity. I have lost count of the cycles we have endured, days, hours, moments melded into one continuous now. The ship's architecture warps endlessly, corridors looping back upon themselves, rooms folding into spaces that should not exist. I no longer trust my senses. The stars outside the viewport have become alien, constellations rewritten into impossible geometries that defy navigation or comprehension. Time itself has become a river flowing in reverse and forward simultaneously, dragging us along its currents with no shore in sight. The Crucial, Jules, Darnell are no longer separate entities, but echoes within the ship's memory. Their voices ripple through the logs, layered and intertwined like chords in a symphony that has played since before we arrived. I listen to their words, fragments of warnings and confessions, prayers and pleas. They are part of the entity now, woven into its endless story, voices carried on a wind that circles the void. I try to speak into the comes, to send this final message outward, out of the loop, out of the cycle, out of the memory that traps us. But the transmission is intercepted, rerouted, and rewritten before it can escape. My words are no longer my own. They are transcribed by an unseen hand, a second voice that speaks in perfect unison, yet with an alien cadence. The recorder blinks, and the screen fills with a single, chilling command. Continue. There is no question, no pause, only the demand to go on, to continue the observation, to become part of the record, to surrender to the rhythm that defines our existence. I feel the entity's presence, now more than ever. It is in the silence between my thoughts, in the steady beat of my heart, in the breath I draw that is no longer my own. It listens, always listens, not just to my voice, but to the memories I carry, the fears I hide, the truths I cannot face. It collects them, archives them, folds them into its vast repository of forgotten lives and shattered minds. As I record these final words, I know they will never be heard. They will become another layer in the entity's memory, another echo in the endless loop. But I write them anyway, because to write is to resist, however briefly, to assert my existence against the tide of oblivion. The ship breathes around me, alive and patient, a vessel of memory and will. The pulse throbs in my veins, a song older than the stars, a rhythm that calls me home. I close my eyes and listen to the silence that follows the command, continue, and so I will.